Ever since Star Wars The Last Jedi was released, the film has had its share of defenders and critics. But the film doesn't seem to fall into any majority opinion. It feels like a 50-50 split. And with so many people attempting to both appreciate the film's quality or criticize its lack of quality, there have been many different arguments brought to the table. But today I wanted to focus on a pattern I have seen particularly with counter-arguments to criticisms of the film. A bizarre logical fallacy is being used on repeat to defend The Last Jedi. This fallacy is called whataboutism. The term stems from the appeal to hypocrisy fallacy. Ultimately, what the term entails is using an unrelated argument against someone which implies hypocrisy without addressing the argument brought up by the opposition. Here's an example of an extreme anecdotal reference used by the character Paul Avery in David Fincher's Zodiac.
You know that we work in the daily business, right? As in today. What do you think we were doing back then? Do you know that more people die in the East Bay commute every 3 months than that idiot ever killed? He offed a few citizens, he wrote a few letters, and he faded into footnote. It's 4 years ago, that ago.
The example which Avery brings up is an outside example which he is using to strengthen his point of view to Robert Graysmith. In this scene, Avery is not using whataboutism. He is simply using a real-world example to strengthen his argument. This scene from Lady Bird, on the other hand, is a prime example of a whataboutism.
You said you were a virgin.
No, I didn't. Because I'm not.
I just wanted it to be special.
Why? You're gonna have so much unspecial sex in your life.
I was on top. Who the is on top their first time?
You mean like awareness of how many civilians we've killed since the invasion in Iraq started?
Shut up! Shut up! Different things can be sad. It's not all war.
Kyle's example is a classic case of whataboutism fallacy. The death of civilians in Iraq has nothing to do with why Lady Bird is upset in this scene. The reason Kyle used this example was to diminish Lady Bird's argument, by saying her ignorance to the death of those civilians means she is hypocritical for being upset over him lying to her. It's a very strange way to argue, and it isn't a great position to base your counter-arguments on. In the context of The Last Jedi, a whataboutism counter-argument usually goes something like this. Someone presents that the bombers used in the opening of The Last Jedi have fundamental design flaws which makes them tactically inefficient if you consider the ships which have been established in previous films, such as Y-Wings. Someone who defends the film responds that AT-ATs are also really silly from a tactical perspective and didn't work too well in The Empire Strikes Back. Therefore, the person presenting the argument is a hypocrite. The main thing which must be understood in deconstructing this fallacy is context. It doesn't matter if item X and item Y in two different Star Wars films are goofy or impractical. It all depends on the context of the film. In the bomber example I just used, if the person was to argue that both AT-ATs and The Last Jedi's bombers looked somewhat silly, this would be a reasonable point to make. It can be applied to both transports in the context of both movies. But if someone were to argue that both have design flaws, therefore you cannot criticize the bombers from The Last Jedi, this argument instantaneously falls apart. The first flaw in this argument is that the AT-ATs were highly effective in their goal. In The Empire Strikes Back, they are used to target the shield generator on Hoth. From what appears to be a minimum of 5 walkers, the AT-ATs managed to take out their target with only 2 casualties. The rest of the transports had armor which protected them from enemy fire over a large period of time, and their cannons were largely effective as offensive measures. To be clear, the first walker is destroyed because of a flaw in the walker's design. Their legs are excessively tall, which makes the AT-AT top-heavy. Therefore, when you tie a cable around the walker's legs, it is very easy to trip it. Plus, when the walker falls, it either exposes a weak spot on the walker's neck, if you will, or the shield shut down entirely, thus making the walker vulnerable. The second walker isn't destroyed by any design flaw. Luke infiltrates the walker from underneath it and is only successful by detonating a massive explosive from inside its armor. A calculated and surgical attack is why the second walker fell. Meaning in total, one walker was destroyed because of strategy and some luck, the other walker was destroyed due to an elaborate tactical measure and a flaw in the design of the AT-ATs. All things said and done, these transports are very efficient. They have strong armor, excellent cannons, carry troops to the rebel base, and only have one significant design flaw. Aside from the fact that their range of use is pretty narrow, AT-ATs are excellent transports. The bombers from The Last Jedi, on the other hand, are built on design flaws. They are immeasurably slow in comparison to the other ships from the Star Wars universe. This single design flaw makes a Y-Wing a superior ship to the bombers from The Last Jedi, as they run just as fast as an X-Wing and are far more maneuverable. You could argue that the payload of the bombers makes them superior to a Y-wing, but this is where the other design flaws come into play. The bombers have inefficient or non-existent shields and weak armor. So weak, in fact, that the debris from a single TIE fighter manages to accidentally destroy 3 of them.
That was no accident. It was by design.
If your ships are that vulnerable and that slow, you would never purchase them. It doesn't matter if a Y-wing may or may not have a less destructive payload. It is an infinitely superior choice. There are many other arguments brought up about the design of the bombers, but these are the 2 main arguments I wanted to tackle. The ships are insanely slow and hilariously brittle. This makes a Y-wing, which is a pre-established ship in the Star Wars universe, a far superior bomber to the Last Jedi bombers. Therefore, the reasonable conclusion to draw is that these ships were designed by the writers to create emotional suspense in the scene, even though they were fundamentally inefficient. And this concept of creating illogical situations for the benefit of emotional weight is a clear example of bad writing in The Last Jedi. This is why whataboutism arguments are rarely dissected. It can take quite some time to explain exactly why the context of the fallacy is inherently flawed. But people continue to use examples from previous Star Wars films in an attempt to justify the existence of objective flaws in the Star Wars trilogy. I'm going to tackle 2 more whataboutisms in this video because you literally could be here all day with the counter-arguments brought up to defend The Last Jedi. I will first cover the undisputed reigning heavyweight champion of whataboutism arguments. In The Last Jedi, Kylo Ren makes a critical decision to kill his master Supreme Leader Snoke. This action is treated as nothing more than a joke in the context of the film, and based on Rian Johnson's Twitter account, it's pretty clear that he didn't intend to answer the questions fans of The Force Awakens had. The most common defense for Rian Johnson's decision is that the Emperor was just as one-dimensional of a villain as Snoke, and he died without the audience knowing his backstory. Therefore, since the Emperor didn't have a backstory, you are a hypocrite if you criticize Snoke for not having a backstory. This counter-argument is complete nonsense, and it ignores the entire context of the Star Wars saga. In the OT, the Empire was reigning above the galaxy, and the rebels were a small group attempting to stop them from using the Death Star. It's only through brief dialogue and moments in the first 2 films that the Emperor is mentioned.
I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently. The last remnants of the old Republic have been swept away.
That's impossible. How will the Emperor maintain control without the bureaucracy?
As the Empire is reigning, there is no need to explain the backstory of the Emperor. One way or another, the film states that he managed to gain control of the galaxy. Even though we didn't need an explanation, we got one anyway. We knew everything we needed to know about the Emperor when considering all rules of the world and everything which had been established in these films. The same does not apply for the sequel trilogy. Return of the Jedi ends with the Empire destroyed, the Emperor dead,
No one's ever really...
and our heroes hanging out with Ewoks without a care in the world. The Force Awakens jump cuts to 30 years later, and literally everything achieved by Luke and the Rebels has been reversed. Let's count off the achievements of Snoke, which are all done off screen and explained only through vague dialogue. He managed to turn the son of Han Solo and Leia Organa to the dark side. He scared Luke Skywalker away from the fight, resurrected the First Order from the ashes of the Empire, inexplicably evaded the attention of the Republic, stole thousands of children from their parents to be brainwashed as soldiers, and has enough money to fund the First Order and oversee the construction of a planet-sized super weapon. None of these accomplishments are explained in The Force Awakens. The audience simply must accept these as part of the story.
Are you gonna deal with?
But it doesn't take a genius to see that these achievements are damn near impossible. Not to mention the fact that Snoke looks to be a drop older than 30 years old, which brings up questions about where he was in the OT. Also, after The Last Jedi, we can confirm without a shadow of a doubt that Snoke is the most powerful Force user in all of the Star Wars films.
You're not doing this. The effort would kill you.
It was I who bridged your minds. I stoked Ren's conflicted soul. I knew he was not strong enough to hide it from you. And you were not wise enough to resist the bait.
That's not how the Force works.
Which brings up questions about where he was in the OT, how he rose to power, and where he received his training in the Force. These questions require a massive explanation in order to fill in the gaps. If they are not explained, then the world building of the sequel trilogy is flawed, because it all depends on knowing how Snoke managed to undo everything our heroes achieved in the OT. Therefore, killing him off and not explaining his backstory is not the same thing as the Emperor's death. There wasn't anything impossible which the Emperor was alluded to doing in the OT which made the world building flawed. We were left to assume he was someone powerful from both a physical and political position, managed to turn Anakin to the dark side over time, and destroy the Jedi, which just so happened to be the case. But with only 30 years of time to spontaneously appear, Snoke's achievements are impossible. Therefore, the world of the sequel trilogy is also impossible. And to disregard his backstory as unimportant and going so far as to make fun of the people who know that it is important is utterly asinine. Snoke and the Emperor are not the same, and the whataboutism argument used to defend Snoke's death is absolutely embarrassing. The final area I want to cover are two scenes from The Last Jedi which are justified through whataboutism arguments in one scene from Return of the Jedi. The first moment is this lovely scene.
Entonces metí entre las piedras de chipiones del faro. Y cuando entro en el restaurante me ve el cocinero con una paellera y a ver solamente paellera.
A common justification for this is that the last thing we saw Luke doing in the OT was throwing his lightsaber away. Once again, there was a different context for this in Return of the Jedi. In that moment, Luke was considering killing his father and chose not to. This was a symbolic action to drive home his point to the Emperor. Luke will never turn to the dark side. He would rather face death than to stand over his father's corpse. In The Last Jedi, on the other hand, we get a cartoon-like scene where Luke tosses his lightsaber over his shoulder with the most passive expression on his face. This action means nothing in the context of the film, and in spite of the defenses of this scene, it is undeniably treated as nothing more than subversion and a joke. Remove the cliff, insert a man walking behind Luke, add a sound effect, and replace the lightsaber with a banana peel, and you have a slapstick cartoon. These scenes bear literally no similarities to each other. One is a critical moment in the arc of Luke Skywalker, while the other is a ridiculous gag intended to subvert the expectations of the audience member. The last scene I want to discuss is the final flashback revealing that Luke considered murdering his nephew Ben Solo in his sleep. Do you remember how I mentioned that Luke in Return of the Jedi chose to face death rather than to stand over his father's corpse? I forgot what I was talking about. Anyway, back to Luke murdering Ben. Many people have attempted poorly to rationalize this action by referencing the fact that Luke went ballistic on Vader in the throne room scene from Return of the Jedi. This was also a moment where Luke became unhinged and lashed out against a potential threat. Therefore, Luke having a similar moment where he lashed out makes complete sense in the context of The Last Jedi. This counter-argument is one of the silliest, most hilarious statements I have ever heard in regards to film criticism. Let me paint the scene in the separate context of both films. In Return of the Jedi, Luke went into the throne room prepared and expecting to die.
You're wrong. Soon I'll be dead, and you with me.
He was confident in the fact that the rebels would succeed in their attack and that he would die believing in his father. The Emperor turns this on Luke, revealing a trap and claiming that all of his friends are going to be slaughtered. After watching the fleet be picked off one by one, Luke goes for his saber and attacks the Emperor, only to be blocked by Vader, who engages Luke in a fight. Luke refuses to fight his father and chooses to hide from Vader. As he taunts Luke, Vader manages to read his mind and finds out about Leia. After this, he threatens to turn her to the dark side if Luke doesn't. So let's review here. Luke witnesses his friends being murdered. He is being attacked by a menacing monster showing no outward sign of humanity, and while he is refusing to fight him, this stubborn, taunting lunatic has the gall to pull the "I'm going after your sister" card on Luke. Luke's response to this is going apeshit on Vader and overpowering him in a fight. This action is also one which is influenced by an urge to protect Leia, albeit a very violent form of defense towards someone else. Now let's take a look at The Last Jedi. Ben Solo is a young Jedi student and the son of two of Luke's best friends. One night, Luke decided to peer into Ben's mind and saw a vague premonition about his future being filled with the pain of the people who Luke loved. Rather than talk to his innocent nephew or try to approach the situation slowly, Luke decided to murder Ben in his sleep. There is literally no other factors which you can point to other than Luke is old and his perspective on life has completely changed. This action makes no sense when considering everything we know about Luke's character. It simply doesn't flow from the context of The Last Jedi and from the context of Luke. The fact that people have connected these two moments as being similar to me is funny. No two ways about it. These scenes bear absolutely no similarities. It is whataboutism in its purest form. Using an argument from a completely separate context to try to discredit an argument based on references from the context of a different film. If you are a fan of Star Wars The Last Jedi or the Disney Star Wars films, then I have nothing against you. I honestly envy that you enjoy these movies. I wish I did. But I urge you to take a look at your defenses of the film and make sure that your arguments do not rely on references from other films with entirely different context from The Last Jedi. Do not use whataboutism arguments. They have no relevancy in discussions on film criticism, and they are nothing short of embarrassing.
I want to bring up something that doesn't get talked about enough. Star Wars has always been weird. Remember the cantina scene? Remember Figrin Dan and the modal nodes? Remember how there's a devil in there just chilling at the bar? And a one-eyed tentacle creature in the trash compactor? Since the very beginning, Star Wars has been full of weird and The Last Jedi lives up to that legacy. The giant alien cow thing that Luke milks is one of my favorite additions to this whole series. And if you don't like it, no offense, but you have boring taste and I don't want to be friends with you.